I'd like to bring on Paul Major from Bellevue Healthcare Trust and Marek Popczynski from International Biotechnology Trust. We're sort of really excited to be doing this. Sort of welcome both, and thank you for joining us today. In sort of no particular order, to kick things off, could I ask Paul, just could you spend sort of a few minutes introducing yourself and the fund, and perhaps tell us why this is all interesting now?
Sure. So I'm Paul Major, co-manager of the Bellevue Healthcare Trust. So we run an unconstrained broad healthcare fund, so we can invest in any subsector of healthcare. And we have a thematic approach to investing. We essentially invest into companies that we believe will play a pivotal role in delivering the products, technologies, and services needed to transform healthcare to make it fit for purpose in a world with an aging population. I think it's obvious to all of your viewers that healthcare systems around the developed world are struggling to cope with the increased demand that an aging population offers, and we're struggling to pay for the services that we have. But the great news is that you could deliver all of this in a much different way, and that is the philosophy that underpins what we do.
Marek, could you do the same, please?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me here. So let's start with International Biotechnology Trusts, focus on mainly biotech, as the name obviously says. We've been around for 30 years and outperformed in the last 1, 3, 5, and 10 years versus the Nasdaq Biotech Index. And our focus is to invest and try to garner the kind of innovative end of the pharmaceutical developments. So we have a strategic approach of trying to have a balanced portfolio between large caps, mid caps, small caps, but also in therapeutic areas, and have specific risk mitigation strategies. Try to avoid binary events and wiping out of some of the companies that sometimes happen when you have a failed clinical study. And that's our approach to try to garner the upside of biotech, which Paul also mentioned, the demographic shift we have in the world. And I think that is the future. We need more drugs coming to the market, simply put it.
Brilliant. Thank you for that. Obviously, I was saying it's sort of quite an interesting time. The sort of whole sector has faced, some quite notable headwinds in recent years, and obviously there's been quite a shifting landscape in the sort of US, and that's a sort of very important market. But equally, obviously, there's lots of signs of sort of progress and opportunities. Perhaps to sort of kick things off. A lot of people have been talking about AI. It's a very popular topic at the moment. There's been talk about how it can be used with sort of drug discovery, sort of in diagnostics, in other areas of documentation, patient comms. Just from through your perspective, I mean, how do you think this is really sort of changing the sort of opportunities for your portfolio companies? And sort of how are you thinking about it in terms of the sort of your portfolios? Perhaps can I sort of throw that to Marek first?
Okay, thank you. So to begin with, my background is within industry. So I did my 15 years, first 15 years working within industry. A lot of investments were in computers and whatever it was called. Now it's rebranded to AI, but computer power has always been a very big part of drug development, because you really need to have that when you kind of screen for drugs. And we believe at IBT that diagnostic is a big thing also when it comes to patient selection, etc. Drug trials, you can maybe potentially accelerate those, and it will enhance drug development in general, and hopefully we'll have fewer failures in toxicology studies, etc. So which means that we will probably have productivity improvements and thus hopefully better profits for the biotech industry and pharma in the long run.
Okay, thank you. Paul, have you anything you sort of add to that?
Yeah, I find the whole AI, Marek described it as a rebranding, which I would completely agree with. I find the market's attitude to this quite interesting, because healthcare, as Marek alluded to, has been at the forefront of adopting and utilizing algorithmic technologies, probably before many other industries. So anyone who's had an MRI scan or a CT scan in the last 10 years, the image processing software is all AI driven. You know, to make life easier for the radiologist that's analysing those scans. Anyone who's ever had a gene sequence or a gene test, that information is analysed using AI algorithms. If it wasn't for AI, we wouldn't have been able to sequence the genome, because we smash it up and put the bits together like a jigsaw, very complicated. So healthcare has been at the forefront of this forever. And you know, the CEO of NVIDIA spoke at a healthcare conference earlier in the year and basically said the healthcare industry is one of their biggest target markets for their super chips that they're making. So healthcare hasn't got credit. Well, it's underperformed the market, as you alluded to, for the last 2.5 years, whilst AI has been the kind of crazy frenzy that everyone's interested in. And yet we've been a success story in all of this. So while everyone debates whether or not Meta paying people $100 million to join the firm or spending $100 billion on building supercomputer clusters is going to deliver an IRR for investors, the simple fact is AI is and has been delivering positive returns for companies and for investors in healthcare for many, many decades, and it will continue to do so. With regard to drug development, you know, there are a couple of companies who've tried to portray themselves as like AI leaders and saying, "Oh, we're doing this all in silico and we're going to be better than AstraZeneca or Glaxo or whatever." That isn't true. These companies aren't doing anything that the big companies aren't doing as well. What I will say is I think the biggest challenge we face in drug development at the moment is actually speeding up the clinical trial component, because once you've come up with an idea and AI can help you come up with an idea, you do ultimately have to test it in some people and find out how it works and how to dose it. And the biggest challenge I think the Western pharma and biotech industry faces right now is, as soon as you come up with a new drug or a new idea, you present it at a medical conference, you file patents, everybody knows about it. And what's happening at the moment, time and time again, is Chinese companies who have looser rules for clinical trials. There's more Chinese people, there's more Chinese hospitals, there's more Chinese PhD students. They are catching up with Western ideas and accelerating them through clinical development faster. So the big pharma companies are now going to China to get products that they license for phase 2 onwards and things like this. And that has been one of the big pressures on the valuations of, I think, Western biotech companies, that people feel they're running a race with their legs tied together. And I think we really need progress from a regulatory perspective to level the playing field a bit and make things easier for Western companies to maximize the value of their IP. And AI will play a role in that, in the sense I think regulators can use virtual tools to be more confident about progressing things through to human trials faster. I know that's a very long answer, but I think it's an important point.
I think that is really, really interesting. I guess it sort of plays into kind of the sort of next sort of area I wanted to touch on, which was the sort of regulation. Obviously, there's been quite a shift in the US. These companies sort of tend to be quite global, or if they're not, their products tend to be sort of inherently global. And the US is a big, important market. The FDA is very important. A lot of other regulators look to sort of what it does when they're formulating their own decisions, etc. I mean, under this sort of administration, which has appeared to be trying to reshape the FDA, what does that really mean for, I guess, the sort of sector? What does this sort of mean for your portfolio companies? Can I sort of start with you, Paul?
Yeah, so this is an enormous area of focus for us. Lots of frustrating time wasted. I've spent more time with lobbyists in the last 6 months than I think I have in the 30 years I've been doing this job, and their insights into what the Trump administration thinks are no better than anyone else's, because I think the question on most people's minds is, does the Trump administration think, or does it just react to things that happen, or pick an idea that it likes today? Um, the reassuring, and again, this is one of the things I think investors are very worried about. I think the reassuring things that we can point to is, you know, since the chaos of Elon Musk and his chainsaw in the early part of the year, what we can see is that there has been a lot of turnover at the FDA, but we're not seeing companies missing approval deadlines. We're not seeing companies reporting difficulties dealing with the agency. We're not seeing an anti-science agenda, which is some of the more hyperbolic left-wing media stuff we got when the election first happened. Yeah, these people don't want science. That's categorically not true. And I think it will take a period of time of seeing nothing's really happening that's bad for people to feel reassured. Um, the other thing I would say is that the FDA leadership, Makari in particular, has talked a lot again about things like AI and improving the tools that the agency deploy to manage the huge amounts of data. There's about 5 million pages in a new drug application. So it's an enormous thing to process, and you're interacting with the agency at every critical step. So you finish a trial, you publish the results, you speak to them, they decide what happens next. All of that can be streamlined and managed better. And they are keen to put the investment in to give the tools to the people that work there to be able to do that. So this may be an unfashionable view, but I'm actually quietly optimistic about the future direction of the agency under its current leadership. Yes, it's less pro industry in the things that it says, but I don't think objectively that's a bad thing. And as long as we don't see slowdowns or deadlines being missed, I think there's nothing to be concerned about.
Okay, and probably just related to that, given that obviously you've got to get regulatory filings in a whole number of jurisdictions potentially, presumably from what you said, AI can probably help you move the documentation through that as well. Is that sort of fair comment? Or
I think every regulator is different.
Yeah.
And it will be interesting to see how quickly they move. Again, the UK, we're a big biotech centre for research. And before Brexit, the European regulator was actually based in the UK. Now it moved back to the continental Europe, but a lot of the people that worked there stayed here. So the MHRA, which is the UK equivalent, we have an opportunity, and I think we demonstrated this during the pandemic with the rapid approval of COVID vaccine. We have the opportunity to carve a path to be really pro-innovation. And so I'm excited about the potential for the UK to move in a similar direction. I think clearly I've already spoken about China. They've got their eye on the prize. They're very pro industry, which is great for them. Less good for us. As regards the European regulator, I mean, generally things in Europe move very sclerotically, so I'm not too optimistic there.
Okay. Sort of Marek, I guess sort of same sort of question really. How are you sort of seeing the impact, particularly say in the US, but actually I guess more sort of broadly in Europe with the sort of regulatory shifts?
I tend to agree with Paul's view on the matter, that it's kind of a lot of media grabbing attention, but reality is we have not seen any delays. But also when you have a new kind of C-level people at the FDA, they come up with a lot of promises and things will change. But I'm more cynical, been around for 25 years, and I think that after a while, when they get settled in, they realize that their job is to get drugs safely and efficaciously through to approval, rather than have opinions about pricing, etc. They just need to focus on doing the day-to-day job, which I think will occupy them going forward. So in my view, I think very little will change. And in fairness, we have, 18 months or something to the next midterm election. After that, we might see another gridlock brewing. So think about it. It's somewhat politicized, FDA versus a kind of a company. So we need to be careful about, interpolating what this new administration will do when we can have a 180-degree change in just 12 months.
Yeah. I guess sort of related, I mean, you picked up on price controls, which is sort of something that, the Trump administration has made a big deal of, which if anything sort of feels slightly unusual coming from, sort of Republican administration. But I guess sort of based on what you've said already, do you think, because we've heard about this so many times before, I mean, is this a thing? Is this really going to have much of an impact? Will it make a difference this time? I don't know. And sort of how does that play out for your portfolio?
Okay, shall I start then? Yeah,
Sorry,
I
that was
think
you,
this.
Marek. Apologies.
No, I think if this happens, it's a big thing. But because we have free pricing in US, I mean, in reality, there is of course price negotiations, etc. And if we have this most favored nation suggestion that has been out there, it will mean that we will have not dissimilar pricing structure like we have in Europe when we reference price to other countries. And it's, US have a much higher pharmaceutical pricing for reasons that not only because they pay more, is because they have a system that kind of encourage or incentivize higher prices. But in general, I think it will have a big impact if it's pushed through. We at IBT, we don't wait for that decision. We try to think about it. What kind of impact will it have on the whole biotech sector and pharma sectors? We have tended to move into areas where we believe pricing is less of an issue. For example, orphan drugs, where Europe and US have relatively similar pricing, and certain other areas where we believe that might be less of an issue. But in general, if this comes through, that will obviously affect the whole pharma sector.
Okay. Paul, I'm getting a message from text. I don't know if you can perhaps speak a little bit sort of close to your microphone. Apparently, you're a little bit faint, and obviously everybody wants to hear what you're saying. If you sort of got anything that you would add to that.
I think Marek touches on an important point with regard to orphan drugs and specialist drugs, firstly. I think, secondly, if you are investing more in pre-commercial companies, which we certainly do within therapeutics, and I know Marek's fund does as well, these companies, because they haven't priced, they can attune their global pricing to whatever rules come through. But there's a more practical question, which is how serious is Trump about this most favored nation thing? Let's not forget, this isn't new. He tried this in his first administration. It didn't go anywhere. If you read the executive order from May the 12th carefully, what it basically says is, I direct federal agencies to come up with a plan, and they are to tell us what this plan looks like by the 11th of June. Now, I make it past the 11th of June, and nothing happens so far. So you can decide for yourself where you think this lies on the priorities of an administration that's promising dozens of trade deals before another deadline, which is the 9th of July, and various wars all around the world, etc., etc., etc. I think Trump can say, look, I tried. I'm with the people because people don't like drug companies and they don't like drug pricing. So as a naked populist, this is a great area to press on, but I don't think they have any realistic ambitions of success. And even if they do, their purview is over the government buying drugs directly. And Marek touched on the complexities of the US system. It's a private free price system. The US only pays for, the government only pays for about 40% of drugs by value. And there's no clarity over how this will be transmitted into the wider market. So again, this is something that spooked the market and led to this relative underperformance, particularly more recently of the sector and particularly the drug companies and the biotech companies. But it feels incredibly hollow to me. And, you know, we haven't spent very much time analysing this because there is nothing to analyse. It's just a very nebulous idea. And I agree with Marek that the sensible thing to do as an investor is to focus on companies that you are confident fall outside of this, because the value of their products is so clear that they price them pretty much the same all around the globe anyway.
Yeah, well, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, both of you in your answers, you sort of picked up on this about sort of areas that obviously you're avoiding, areas that obviously you're leaning into more. I guess sort of probably a key question. I'll throw this to Marek first. I mean, perhaps what are the sort of really exciting areas that you're looking at? Where are you sort of seeing perhaps the sort of really big opportunities at the moment?
It's a really good question. I think Paul mentioned something earlier regarding the China is kind of very quick on reacting on when you have a publication somewhere, and I agree with Paul on that China is taking the early stage kind of pharma is buying early stage projects because they can get it cheaper from China than paying US or European companies. But what we have seen of lately, and as I previously mentioned, orphan drugs is one of the area which we, because you address a high medical need, you're often the only drug around and people are willing to pay for it. And secondly, what we have realized, but just to mitigate our strategies, there's a lot of companies, biotech companies, that have managed to pass through phase 3. We have not seen it for a while now. And we believe they might actually launch themselves. And this is the area which is very interesting at the moment, we see, because also the previous Paul mentioned, as I agree with, they can price the drug accordingly because they have the global rights. They don't need to launch in Europe. Sadly enough, I think the consequence, if this ever will be implemented, Europe will have a lag in launches because US is the main market. I think 50% of global sales, probably 60, 70% of profits. And this is the area we like. If you look at our top 10, you can see the majority of companies are relatively mid-sized, but also relatively innovative, and they will hopefully launch themselves or be acquired. And this is the area we like to be at the moment. Of course, that might change depending on the kind of macro environments and the political shifts that's ongoing. It's a very, very fluid market at the moment.
Yeah. See, Paul, your portfolio's got a sort of different shape. I mean, where are you seeing those sorts of opportunities?
I think Marek touched on diagnostics. Diagnostics has, and I think always will be, a big focus for us, because if you think about healthcare as a kind of a bit like a sausage machine, you go in one end and something comes out the other. The first part of this is working out what's actually wrong with you, and it's worth bearing in mind that $1 in 4 spent in healthcare globally is wasted, and a large part of that is administration, which can be simplified with AI and various tools we've already touched on. But another part of it is the simple differential diagnostic process. So if you think about how do you enter the healthcare system, you, generally a person with no medical training, sits down with a GP and you say, I feel unwell, and they say, what's wrong with you? And you tell them what you think's wrong with you, which is pretty wild just to begin with. And then they send you on a discursive journey through various other people and other tests to work out what's wrong with you. Now, if you look at this completely objectively from a scientific point of view, everything that's happening in your body, good and bad, is molecular switches coming on and going off. And there are signs of that activity through the body, either genetically or with various other signaling molecules. And increasingly, we can pick these things up very quickly. And we can also increasingly test samples in real time from real biological fluids. So some of this stuff is pretty amazing in terms of the differences it can make. I'll give you just a very simple example. If you think about sepsis, you get bacteria in your blood. If you don't treat it aggressively within the first 24 hours, you will die. Generally speaking, the bacteria that are growing in your blood are quite unusual. They're actually often soil bacteria, which is why they love the blood, because it's warm and full of nutrients and things like that. And often you could kill them with very cheap antibiotics, but you don't know which one's going to work. And those same bacteria, if you try and grow them in a lab, they grow quite slowly, funnily enough. So you can't take the risk. You have to use really broad spectrum aggressive treatment,
Right.
really expensive treatment immediately to save people's lives. There are actually machines you can buy now where you can take a sample from the blood and it will tell you in a couple of hours, what the bacteria is and also what antibiotics will respond to it. And that can save lives and tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars. So those sorts of innovations in diagnostics, point of care, risk mitigation for things like cancer and all these different things, they are going to transform healthcare. And it's been a very successful area for us. And I think it will continue to be for many decades to come, because the future of healthcare is precise diagnosis and precise tailored treatment.
Okay. Perhaps we just to come back to the opportunity set. There's been a lot of talk about how big pharma companies, etc., have sort of got upcoming patent expirations. And it's one of those things that seems to go in cycles. Perhaps if we sort of start with you, Paul. I mean, I guess where do you kind of sort of see the opportunities and threats there, and how's that sort of affecting your portfolio? I imagine I'll sort of ask Marek next. He's probably coming from it from a sort of quite a different perspective. But let's say if we start with you, Paul, where do you see that going?
Yeah, it's been an interesting couple of years in this regard. So as a rule of thumb, 1 in 3 products launched by big pharma has been innovated elsewhere. So either in license from a biotech company or a biotech company is acquired. Over the last couple of years, there hasn't been very much M&A in public markets. A couple of reasons for that. One is under Biden, the FTC was pretty aggressive. That's gone now, hopefully under Trump. The second reason is that the VC market, the biotech IPO market basically collapsed, and lots of VCs found themselves trying to wind up funds, and they were long a biotech company they couldn't shift. So you saw discounted valuations for private assets for the last couple of years, and so a lot of the M&A's kind of been there. But I think the longer time goes on, the more pressing it becomes to to do some really banner deals, because as you allude to, there are some very, very substantial patent cliffs coming up for some very large companies, Merck, Bristol, and so on. And they've got to do something. And I think there's also some very, very large target markets across cardiovascular, respiratory, next generation obesity and weight management, which is a market that doesn't really exist yet, the second bit. These are very, very attractive to big pharma, and there are some very interesting companies in the biotech space, and valuations across those spaces are actually surprisingly differentiated. So some are look very expensive, some look incredibly cheap. So we are obviously exposed to that, and I think on a 2-year view, we bet on a much higher level of M&A than we've seen over the past 2 years, because there's no other obvious solution for these guys.
Yeah. So what are your thoughts on that, Marek? I mean, presumably this is potentially quite a big opportunity for your space.
Yeah, I concur with Paul regarding that pharma needs to do something. And one way that happened 15 years ago, that we had massive consolidation when big pharma kind of acquired each other. It didn't pan out very well, but doesn't mean that they will not try it again. It's fifth time maybe or something. They will try it again probably, because sales are dwindling and patents are running out, and these late stage biotechs have not been picked up, which we have thought would be. And as Paul mentioned, we had during the COVID pandemic, we have an overinvestment or too cheap money coming in, and biotech, the XBI index, which is the small cap index, went up 150% in 9 months, I think, and then corrected 70% in the consecutive 9 months. It's not healthy for the industry to have that behavior. And since then, we have had basically 5 years of plateauing, which means that we have consolidated, digested a lot of these companies that probably shouldn't be there. And I read in a note recently from a bank that around 20-25% of companies were valued below cash a couple of months ago. I don't think that have changed materially since then, because biotech is basically in the same levels. So that's interesting. We have a productivity cleanup at the moment ongoing. So I'm very much positive, like as Paul said, that we will see M&A picking up or consolidation, but something will definitely happen.
Okay. I guess sort of related to that, are you sort of seeing, or obviously you've had this feast in terms of sort of financing, and now it's moved to fam. Can you kind of sort of see that normalizing at all? And I just wanted to pick up on the sort of point that Paul made about VC sort of funding collapsing, which obviously related to this. You kind of figure obviously this may create more sort of opportunities for sort of your kind of companies to buy into these sort of opportunities equally. Perhaps if there's not the funding in the first place, they don't even get there. So I guess, what does that mean for you?
Shall I start? I mean, I think you touched on a number of interesting points. Marek mentioned that all the companies trading below cash. There's something like 150, 160, what the Americans call zombie biotechs. So the problem with scientists is they've always got another idea. So when we fail at our jobs, we generally get fired, or something bad happens. When you're a scientist, you pivot and you say, I've got another fantastic idea, and I'm going to spend all the shareholders' money that's left over on this new thing. So biotech companies are very good at changing what they do, changing their name and so on, until they run out of money. And there are a lot of companies, as Marek alluded to, that came to the market post-COVID on the excitement around, healthcare saved us all, that should never have got the amount of money they got, or maybe shouldn't be public companies because they're too early in the process, and they need to be cleared up. So for the first time, I think ever, certainly in my recollection, we're actually seeing some of these turkeys voting for Christmas, winding themselves up, giving money back, or turning themselves into cash shells, which actually is an alternative to the VCs not being able to IPO. So you can effectively merge your non-public biotech with a cash shell, and then you get a listed entity with some cash and hopefully a newer, better idea. So I think as that cleanup process goes through, it will greatly improve the performance of or the perception of the performance of biotech. 'Cause part of the reason, Marek touched on the XBI, it's a very strange index, but part of the reason that its performance is so appalling is because it's being dragged down by this sea anchor of all these zombie companies. So as they disappear, you will just naturally see a greater proportion of the performance coming from real companies doing real stuff, and it will start to look better. And I think when that happens, the IPO window will reopen and the whole thing will go back to a more normal, hopefully 2016 to 2019 kind of period of a regular flow of interesting companies doing innovative science and investors that back them actually being rewarded. Because the other thing that's happened as a consequence of this is, if you look at investor returns by year of IPO, we call them like vintages. If you'd have invested, $100 in every single one, I think barring 1 year, you'd have lost money every year since the end of the pandemic by doing so. That needs to change as well for investors to get excited about early stage biotech as as an opportunity. And I think that's simply avoiding these things is a great way to generate incremental outperformance in biotech, which is clearly what Marek's been doing. So.
It's cool. Just getting some questions coming in on the live chat, which I want to try to address. There's one here. It says, Paul, can you talk about Dexcom, please?
Sure. So diabetes is a massive problem for society, as we all know. Type 1 diabetics don't produce insulin. Type 2 is more of a lifestyle condition that will ultimately lead to a dependency on insulin. The early phases of the disease are reversible. And one of the things that's really interesting is actually very high spikes in your blood glucose that damage the systems, the feedback systems, and lead to persistent type 2 diabetes. One of the ways you can avoid that or become aware of it is to wear a blood glucose monitor. So this is a small thing about the size of a 50p. It sits on your arm, goes under your skin, connects to your phone, and it measures your blood sugar. Now, if you get unhealthy people to wear one of these, they'll stop going to Dunkin' Donuts after a few times because their phone will be ringing at them and they'll see their blood sugar spiking and it will terrify them. And the companies that make these sensors, particularly Dexcom and Abbott, both of which are in our portfolio, have started selling devices aimed at effectively early stage or non-diabetic patients. You're probably seeing a lot more people now, it's summer months and their arms are out, walking around with these things. They become a bit of a fashion statement in and of themselves. So we see very, very significant growth for these devices in a preventative and in a disease management role. But 2 days ago, the Department of Health and Human Services in the United States basically said promoting these is going to be a massive focus for the agency. It's going to be their biggest campaign ever because they need to reverse the epidemic of type 2 diabetes. And as I say, if you get people in the first couple of years of them presenting with symptoms, this is a reversible disease. You just need to get them to stop these blood sugar spikes and start to eat in a more balanced and nutritious manner.
Thank you. Got a couple of questions here for you, Marek. Sort of related. One here says, is your portfolio sort of currently more focused on large cap stability or emerging innovators? And also, are there any themes or technologies that you're especially bullish or cautious on?
It's a really good question. I would say that we, at the moment, believe that maybe the biggest biotechs are, in our view, have a very price to perfection. And I think personally, maybe pharma could be a better option because it's been flight to safety within the biotech. We tend to like, at the moment at least, the kind of mid-stage, meaning in our universe, those have passed phase 3. We are very much therapeutic agnostic because you never know what the next innovation is. And if you can look at our top 10, we have 10 to be in respiratory, but one big theme is orphan in general. Vertex is a company, not it's cystic fibrosis is $100 billion company, and their biggest program is within orphan. So maybe it's misnomer, but in generally speaking, that's the areas we like because they have a faster way through regulatory, generally smaller trials, and it's harder to kind of compete against. But when it comes to therapeutic areas, orphan and maybe CNS of lately, central nervous system, after the pandemic, the depressions and these things came up more into the air, and we think that's very much unserved at the moment.
Okay. Got a sort of couple of questions on the funds here themselves, and perhaps we'll sort of put them both to you. Somebody's asking sort of to what extent you're sort of using buybacks at the moment, and really, I guess, sort of how you trade that off against other ways you may sort of deploy capital. But sort of broadly speaking, with the discounts, sort of how are you tackling those? Do you want to take that, Paul?
Yeah, sure. Very simple one for us. Our board has implemented a zero discount policy, so we are buying back regularly and frequently. We had a annual redemption facility since inception. The structure of ours, unfortunately, I think with hindsight wasn't optimal, and it made us very attractive to arbitrage investors. So we needed to do something about that and reassure longer term investors that we could address that, and that's what our zero discount policy is intended to do, and that has been successful in managing that discount at a much lower level.
Okay. Marek, have you got any sort of comments about how you guys go about this?
Yeah, I mean, our discount has been kind of like our peers, bar BBH, of course, that have implemented their zero discount policy. And it's a decision for the board, obviously, but as you can see and follow, we have seldom stretched, been above double-digit discounts over the time. So that has been kind of, it's not a red line in the sand, but you can look at our performance and our NAV discount over time.
Okay, thank you. Paul, I've got quite a technical question for you. So, one, forgive me for this, and if you don't have an answer, that's perfectly fine. But it says US Department of Defense has just awarded Thermo Fisher a 5-year contract as part of the US Navy with a radiation dosimetry system. Do you have a view on this? I don't even know what a radiation dosimetry system is. So,
no.
in a nutshell, right? That answers that. Just to sort of go back to, I guess, some of the M&A, which somebody was saying was increasing theme. I mean, do we think that the sort of way the market's evolving are sort of companies perhaps getting more bolder, or are they very much still to bargain hunting? Do you want to take that, Marek?
Yeah, definitely we can see pharma companies bargain hunting, and that is reflected in the premiums being paid. During the last couple of months, we held SpringWorks was our biggest position in the portfolio, and it garnered, I think, 30% premium, which is great, but still a bit of a disappointment for us. When it comes to Intracellular was better. It was also our largest position. But as you can see of lately, the premiums have been quite small. And considering the correction we had in the biotech sector, it's still the premiums are relatively small. And pharma and big biotech is bargain hunting. And I think they are smart about it. Why not?
Absolutely. You got anything to add to that, Paul? I mean, presumably this is generally more advantageous for the sorts of companies you're holding. So,
well, it's interesting on both sides. So again, we spent quite a bit of time focusing on this, talking to bankers, VCs, and people involved in financing more broadly to try and understand what's going on. Because again, in my 3 decades of experience, this is unprecedented. So we own a company called BioMarin, and it bought a company called Inzi a few weeks ago for a price that was, I think, 3 to 4 times lower than the average price target that was on the stock. And what happened in that situation was the company was running out of cash. It needed to do a fundraise. Our understanding is that they tiptoed around shareholders and said, "Will you give us more money?" And everyone said no. At which point you have no choices. So you have to sell yourself or go bust. And because everybody knows what position you're in, you're not exactly in the greatest negotiating position ever. And we're seeing more and more of these deals. And I think we're seeing some very clever financing done by some very large players in the market to step in when these things happen. And they're being alerted to these situations by bankers. So there's interesting opportunities for them. But if you speak to the medium-sized biotech companies, the kind of companies Marek was alluding to, they also are bargain hunting, because they're sort of saying, well, we know who's running out of money. It's not a secret. If you happen to be in that unfortunate situation of running out of money before you reach a clinical data point that's going to get investors interested in your story again, you have very few choices.
Yeah.
And so I think we could see value accretion right the way across the spectrum here. And I even think, again, you know, for companies that need to do financing, some of these cash shell companies could in and of themselves be interesting. It's like, right, well, you know, you've got loads of cash and no ideas. We've got an idea and no cash. Let's get together and make something together. So I think we will see consolidation at the small end, and a bit like the sea, you know, every fish is going to eat one fish smaller than itself all the way up to the top of the food chain.
Oh, that's a beautiful analogy. I don't know if anybody wants to sort of take this. It's obviously quite a political question. Does anybody have a view on sort of RFK Jr.'s role in the US Department of Health? Does anybody?
I'm very happy to step in on that one. If
Please do, Paul.
One of the great joys of being at Bellevue is we're allowed to speak freely. So I'm happy to do so. So is RFK a crazy person? To be discussed. I mean, clearly he has espoused some conspiracy theories and certainly done some interesting and colourful things in his youth. If we actually look at what he's done so far since being at HHS, he hasn't done anything too wild. You know, people were very worried when he sacked all the members of the ACIP vaccination committee and announced he was appointing some new people. The ACIP committee meeting is going on at the moment. There are a few voices now on that committee who were critical of what happened during COVID. I think reasonably, you know, that the whole information stream during COVID wasn't handled very well around the vaccines. And many of the problems we have today are because of that lack of entertaining debate and discussion. So I think you have to divorce the track record from what he's actually doing so far. And I think it's been much more measured. And I think the other thing to bear in mind if you're a healthcare investor is his big shtick is food. He believes that the food that we're eating the Americans are eating is unhealthy and all this sort of stuff. There are something like 80 food ingredients in common use in the US that are actually banned in the European Union. And one of the reasons that we couldn't get a post-Brexit trade deal with the US the first time round was because they wanted us to take foodstuffs that we refused to take because of these ingredients. So I personally don't think he's wrong about that stuff. I think he's barking up a few wrong trees when he's saying, you know, in 9 months we're going to elucidate the cause of autism, you know, which is clearly a polygenic, highly complicated condition. That ain't going to happen. But as long as everything he does is in the public domain and is evidence led, and there's a discussion going on, which is so far what we see, I don't particularly think he's someone to cause anyone undue angst. Quite what he thinks of his boss consuming McDonald's all day, every day is another fascinating question I'd love to know the answer to.
Brilliant. Mark, have you got anything that you'd like to add to that at all?
No, I actually agree with Paul on almost all of the things that he's in favor of better food in the US, and who can disagree? I mean, they're very highly processed food, and a lot of the diseases that they have, I mean, life expectancy is lower than Europe, whereas GDP is much higher. So I think that's kind of a good thing. And I mean, some of the things that the FDA have done, I mean, it's a pendulum when it comes to FDA. Sometimes they've been lax, and now maybe they will be more restrictive. Who knows? But some of the drugs they have approved, I have a hard time, you know, reconciling myself, thinking this was too lax. And what happens when you approve drugs with too lax criteria? You send a message to early stage companies that they don't need to do strict trials, and then the whole quality of the industry is lowered. And maybe it's some of the things that now is reversed, like, okay, now we will have the kind of placebo controlled studies. Maybe not you can demand that in every instance, but maybe going back to having stricter criterias. And you can argue it's not business friendly from in the short term, but in the long term you will have higher quality drugs being approved, and that's what I think is the key. So RFK is a lot of news and people like to bash him, but reality is that who knows, and he has not done any damage yet as far as we know.
Yeah, I'd just like to add, sorry, one thing to what Marek said. I think he makes a really good point about quality, and I think again, if we focus on this concern about China, you know, part of the validation for these cheap products that Big Pharma is picking up is they've successfully completed a phase 2 trial that wasn't done in the US, because you can't do them quickly in the US. And I think if the FDA were to police clinical trial standards more aggressively and insist on US patient trials being a critical gating point or whatever, I think we could potentially neutralize some of this strategic threat coming from other marketplaces. So I do agree that and as much as some analysts sort of say, oh no, we've got this new regime, they're not industry friendly like the old ones, I think it's a dose of medicine they have to swallow, but the longer term end game of all of this could actually be very positive for the industry and lead to greater levels of certainty for investors, which I think would be good.
Okay. And I think that certainly makes a lot of sense. While we're on the sort of politics, and I know this is a sort of, continually moving goal. Perhaps start with Marek. Have you got any sort of comments on the situation with the sort of tariffs? Has this been a sort of significant concern? Once again, going back to the fact that these are essentially quite global companies.
Yeah, it's a very good question regarding tariffs. The biggest thing is that we have uncertainty. Once we have certainty, we know that companies will adapt to the rules. I mean, Ireland, a lot of companies, they put their patent IP on Ireland and pay very low taxes for that. And that might be questionable, you know, going forward. Like, okay, why should certain countries benefit from selling drugs somewhere else? That's not number one. But the second one, to Paul's mention earlier, we have not heard anything from them, from the US, and maybe they will not implement, because last time he mentioned and talked about tariffs, the stock market totally tanked. Maybe he doesn't want to go through that once again.
Would you add anything to that, Paul?
Yeah, I would take a slightly different tack. So Trump has implemented, there are different ways you can do tariffs. There's this whole Liberation Day reciprocal tariff thing, which the legality of which is to be debated and is being prosecuted as we speak through various levels of federal court. I don't think we're going to get a ruling one way or the other on any of that means anything before August. In the meantime, they claim we're going to have these tariffs by the 9th of July. Certain industries face another problem. So there's something called the Trade Liberation Act, and it has a section called Section 232. And if Congress rules that there's a national security implication from an industry, then the president has carte blanche to impose tariffs. So this has happened on steel and aluminium. They were 25% under Biden when the first thing Trump did was raise them to 50. So Trump has requested 232 investigations into two industries on national security grounds. One is semiconductors, which is wild because I think 80% of the global semis market is the US, but they only make 40% of the chips. I can't think of anything that doesn't have a microchip in it. So that's a pretty crazy area to prosecute. The other one is pharmaceuticals. Now, you know, Marek touched on IP and royalties and Ireland and all these sorts of things. I think the reality of this is that what you price ingredients at, where you mark them up from one stage to another, you know, when you put the powder in a capsule or blend it or whatever you do, is all up for a lot of gamesmanship. And most of the profits come from the IP royalties, which are paid by the selling company, so the marketing bit at the end. So, you know, pharma companies have very high gross margins, 85, 90% in many cases. If you think about 20, 30% tariffs on that, it's actually a small percentage of overall EBIT. I think you can gain this. I think the pharma industry has done a fantastic job of pointing out that pharmaceutical plants are complex and you can't just implement this, you know, tomorrow and then expect things to change. It will take a period of time. And many pharma companies are very cleverly committed to either reiterating previous CapEx in the US or adding more capex in the US. So I think the biggest issue is uncertainty right now. We know this report is going to come. We don't know when, we don't know what it's going to say, and we don't know if it's going to lead to tariffs at the end. But I think there will be a positive or non-scary resolution of this in due time. You've just got to wait.
Okay. I'm just so conscious of time. We're coming up to the hour. This has been really interesting. We've covered a sort of heck of a lot of ground. Really, just before we finish, perhaps if I sort of start with you, Paul, just sort of tell us really why sort of BBH and why now?
Yeah, sure. Well, I'd certainly do the why now, and then you know, as I say, we're a broad healthcare fund, so we're across the spectrum. But if you look at healthcare, it's underperformed over the last 2.5 years, the wider market by 50%. The tariff situation appears more complex, but probably isn't. And many of the things that people are worried about, you know, we've talked about the FDA, we've talked about regulation in the US politics, all these sorts of things. Let's just take a step back. There are ever more people in the world. GDP per capita across the world is rising. Once you have food in your belly and a roof over your head, you have the luxury of worrying about staying well. So as countries industrialize, they consume more healthcare. People are getting older. So I can think 5, 10, 20 years in the future, people are going to consume more of the stuff our companies make. That's a fact. Lots of other things are unclear within the capital markets and within industries. The fundamentals of our industry have not changed. They are not broken. Therefore, this 50% underperformance is very difficult to understand rationally and objectively. At some point, there will be a catch up. I'm not going to pretend that I know when it is, but it feels that we are at the bottom sentiment wise. And if you're a patient long-term investor, I think you should look again at healthcare, look at those fundamentals. You'll like what you see. And this is something you should be exposed to if you are investing for the medium to long term.
Super. Marek, the sort of same question, but for sort of IBT. Why now?
Why now? I agree with Paul. You can never time when things start to move, but I totally agree. We are basically at the same levels from the Nasdaq Biotech Index as we were 7 years ago. And fundamentally, this industry grows, and we have ever increasing number of clinical trials. The proportion of drugs approved from biotech has increased, as Paul mentioned, to 70% last year. So the fundamental drivers are there, and it's just a matter of time. And we believe we are positioned in a manner that can garner the majority or the upside potential. We are not pretending that this is an easy industry. We know that we have clinical trials are difficult. At the moment, we have been focused on a later stage programs and products where we believe either the company will launch by themselves or will be acquired, because the features these companies have is what everyone is looking for, addressing an unmet medical need. And pricing at the moment, we believe the companies are fairly or lowly priced.
Excellent. Once again, sort of thank you both. As I said, I think it's a really interesting time to be talking about this, and we've sort of covered a lot of ground. Hopefully we can get you guys back at some point in the future and just sort of talk about how all of this is progressing. Right, to sort of just wrap this up, we'll pop back next week when we are going to have sort of Andrew McHattie doing his usual sort of monthly roundup for sort of what will have happened in June. And we've also got Hamish Maxwell from Scottish Mortgage as next week's sort of special guest. But in the meantime, thanks to Marek and thanks to Paul, and hopefully see you all again next week. Bye for now. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.